In the spring of 1944, the meadows of France played host to the most formidable gathering of armored might the world had ever seen. This was the Panzer Lehr Division. Unlike any other unit in the German Wehrmacht, Lehr was not composed of raw recruits or weary conscripts. Every single soldier, from the tank commanders to the infantrymen, was a veteran instructor drawn from the elite panzer schools of Germany. They were the men who taught the Reich how to fight, and now they were being sent to the front to demonstrate their perfection. Led by General Fritz Bayerlein, a man who had served as Rommel's chief of staff in the desert, Panzer Lehr was an iron fist in every sense of the word. While other divisions struggled with horse-drawn wagons and mismatched equipment, Lehr was 100% mechanized. Every infantryman rode in an armored SD KFZ-251 half-track. Its tank regiments were a terrifying museum of modern lethality. Rows of sleek Panthers with their high-velocity 75mm guns and massive Tiger tanks that could shrug off Allied shells like pebbles. Even their reconnaissance units were equipped with heavy armored cars that could outfight most Allied light tanks. To the German High Command, Panzer Lehr was the ultimate insurance policy against an invasion. They were the elite fire brigade, designed to sit back from the coast, wait for the Allies to land, and then strike with a concentrated power that would drive the invaders back into the sea. The men of Lehr were confident, almost arrogant. They possessed the best armor, the best training, and the most experienced officers. They believed that no force on earth could withstand a synchronized charge of their armored regiments. However, as they sat hidden under the lush canopies of French forests, a silent shadow was growing over them. They were prepared for a battle of steel against steel, a duel of tanks that they were certain to win. But the war had changed. As they polished their Panther turrets, the Allied air forces were already mapping every road and bridge in Normandy. The Iron Fist was ready for a fight, but they were about to discover that in 1944, having the best tanks didn't matter if you couldn't move them without the sky falling on your head.
When the order finally came on June 6, 1944, for Panzer Lehr to move toward the Normandy coast, General Bayerlein knew he was racing against time. But as the sun rose, his elite division entered a new and terrifying reality. The Iron Fist found itself paralyzed by an enemy it could not reach. From the clouds emerged the Jabos, short for jogged bomber, the Allied P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons that had turned the French sky into a private hunting ground. The march to the front, which should have taken hours, turned into a grueling multi-day odyssey of fire and death. The Jabos didn't just attack, they haunted the roads. Using cab rank tactics, Allied pilots circled high above, waiting for the slightest movement on the ground. The moment a Panther tank or an armored half-track ventured out from the shadows of the trees, the sky would scream. P-47s would dive at 400 miles per hour, unleashing a barrage of 5-inch rockets and .50 caliber machine gun fire that shredded the thin top armor of even the mightiest tanks. General Bayerlein's diaries reflect a sense of helpless fury. He described the roads of Normandy as graveyards of burning steel. His elite instructors, men who had conquered Europe and fought in the sands of Africa, were being picked off one by one before they ever saw an American or British tank. The division was forced to move only at night, crawling through the darkness with dimmed headlights. But even then, Allied flares would light up the sky, turning night into day for the waiting bombers. By the time the head of the column reached the front, Panzer Lehr had already lost scores of vehicles and hundreds of its irreplaceable veteran soldiers. The psychological impact was devastating. The elite crews felt naked. They realized that their superior training and thick armor were useless against a rocket from above. The Jabos had stripped the Blitzkrieg of its speed. The most powerful division in the West had been bloodied and broken not by a legendary tank duel, but by the relentless, humming shadow of air power that refused to let them move. On July 25, 1944, the Panzer Lehr Division occupied a thin slice of the front line near Saint-Lô. They were dug in, waiting for the inevitable American ground assault. But the Americans had no intention of fighting a traditional battle. Instead, they launched Operation Cobra. For the men of Lehr, this was the day the laws of physics seemed to vanish. It was the day the earth melted. At exactly 11 a.m., the horizon to the north darkened. A massive fleet of 2,500 Allied aircraft, heavies, mediums, and fighter bombers approached in a formation that stretched for miles. For the next 3 hours, they unleashed a carpet of nearly 4,000 tons of high explosives onto a rectangular box of land just 5 miles wide. The bombardment was so dense that individual explosions could no longer be heard. It was a single, continuous, bone-shaking roar that vibrated the very bedrock of France. General Bayerlein later described the scene with horror. This was not a tactical strike, it was industrial-scale erasure. Panzer Lehr was caught at the epicenter. The pressure waves from the bombs were so intense that they ruptured the lungs of soldiers in deep foxholes. Massive 45-ton Panther tanks were tossed through the air like autumn leaves, landing upside down in craters 30 feet deep. The dust and smoke became so thick that midday turned into a pitch-black midnight, illuminated only by the orange flashes of bursting shells. When the bombers finally departed, Panzer Lehr, the finest division in the Wehrmacht, had ceased to exist as a functional unit. 70% of its personnel were dead, wounded, or missing. The survivors were found wandering in a daze, their eardrums burst, their minds shattered by the sheer vibration of the earth. Bayerlein reported to his superiors that his positions had been turned into a moonscape. There were no roads, no hedges, and no landmarks left, only a sea of overlapping craters. The Iron Fist had not been defeated in a tank battle, it had been pulverized into the soil by the crushing weight of the sky. After the thunder of the 2,500 bombers finally faded, a terrifying, heavy silence descended over the sector. But it was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of a graveyard. As the dust began to settle, the survivors of Panzer Lehr crawled out from the debris into a world they no longer recognized. The lush green bocage of Normandy had vanished. In its place was a gray, pulverized wasteland, a moonscape where the very geography of France had been rewritten by high explosives. For the German officers, the horror was not just the loss of life, but the total collapse of tactical control. Their maps, carefully marked with hedgerows, stone walls, and crossroads, were now useless. The roads had been swallowed by craters 30 feet wide, and the landmarks used for navigation had been ground into fine powder. General Bayerlein, wandering through the ruins of his command post, described seeing his elite crews in a state of catatonic shock. Men who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front were found weeping, their nervous systems shattered by the sheer atmospheric pressure of the carpet bombing. The moonscape became a surreal battlefield where armored doctrine went to die. The remaining Panther tanks were trapped in a labyrinth of craters. Every time a driver tried to maneuver, the loose, churned-up earth would give way, causing the 45-ton machines to slide helplessly into pits. Communications were non-existent, the antennas had been snapped, and the telephone wires buried under tons of soil. Small groups of German infantry, isolated and deaf from the blasts, fought desperate, disjointed skirmishes against American troops who were now advancing through the dust. These survivors were fighting in the dust of giants. They were the remnants of the world's most elite mechanized force, now reduced to crawling through holes in the ground, using scavenged weapons to defend a land that had been physically erased. The psychological transition was total. The pride of the Wehrmacht had been humbled. They realized they were no longer fighting a war of maneuvers. They were merely waiting for the next wave of fire from the sky. The elite Panzer Lehr was no longer a division. It was a collection of broken men lost in a gray, air-made desert.
The total destruction of the Panzer Lehr Division marked more than just a tactical defeat on a French map. It signaled the permanent death of the Blitzkrieg. For years, the German military had terrorized Europe with the doctrine of lightning war, a philosophy built on speed, concentrated armor, and the psychological shock of the Panzer spearhead. But in the smoking craters of Normandy, that doctrine was proven obsolete. The German generals were forced to accept a bitter modern truth. No matter how elite the soldier or how thick the steel, the tank was no longer the king of the battlefield. The sky had claimed the throne. In the post-war interrogations, General Fritz Bayerlein delivered a final somber assessment that resonated through military academies for decades. He stated that the presence of Allied air power had turned the Panzer Lehr into a stationary target. The Blitzkrieg relied on mobility, but the Allied fighter-bombers had turned every road into a death trap. Bayerlein remarked that the division's superior training was irrelevant when they could only move under the cover of darkness and were forced to abandon their tanks the moment a single P-47 appeared on the horizon. The era of independent armored thrust was over. The tank had become a secondary player to the pilot. This final assessment highlighted a catastrophic failure in German strategic planning. They had built the most technologically advanced armored force in history, yet they had neglected the one thing that could protect it: air superiority. The legacy of Panzer Lehr served as a brutal lesson for the future of land warfare. An army without control of the air is an army waiting to be executed. The iron fist had been crushed by the silver wing. As the survivors of Lehr were marched into captivity, they left behind a landscape that served as a monument to the end of an era. The Blitzkrieg was born in the dust of the Polish plains, but it died in the mud and craters of Operation Cobra. The world had entered the age of total aerial supremacy. For the military minds of the future, the fate of Panzer Lehr remained the ultimate warning. In modern war, the battle is won or lost in the clouds long before the first tank engine is ever started.